Thank you and welcome. It's a really a great privilege for me personally, and I think for all of us to welcome Professor Ramakrishnan. This is in service. He's very much my senior. In fact, by the time I went to Government of India, he had already left Government of India, retired, and moved on to international multilateral organizations. But I would say my first knowledge about his work was when we looked at the draft of the Calcutta Metropolitan Development Authority, which he was putting together in the form of legislation, architecture, planning permissions, planning institutions, etc. in Calcutta. And this became a kind of a model for several cities in India, closely followed in Chennai by the MMD, Madras Metropolitan Act, followed by the Bangalore Act, and subsequently several cities adopted this as a principle. And we are talking actually of the early 70s. And at that time, the concept of looking beyond the idea of a municipality into a metropolitan agglomeration, more or less as a city governance measure, and the requirements of that governance was a very new thought at that time. And I would say that he is the single person who has introduced this idea into India. And his subsequent responsibilities and positions have enabled him to enlarge this idea, to bring it into a focus in several cities in India. When he was at the Ministry of Urban Development in the center, he crafted the constitutional amendments which have given the urban local bodies their delegated powers of governance, of planning, as well as financial autonomy. And for me, it's a great privilege and honor to be here at the same table as him. Even after retirement, he has been continuously working in the area of his love and interest. And currently, with the Center of Policy Research, he chairs CCPR in Delhi. And at the Center of Policy Research, he's working on this particular topic, which is the topic of today's discussion, and that's megacity regions in South Asia, growth and governance. And during lunch, he was telling us that the concept is to look beyond limited concepts of municipalities, corporations, city governance structures, into the requirements of the region, or more or less the entire region that the city is expected to serve, is expected to be served by. And what are the requirements of governance and administration, and rules and institutions that such a group would require. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Ramakrishnan to share his thoughts with us.
So thank you very much, Dr. Narayan. Well, I'm very grateful to all of you for sparing your afternoon. When Dr. Narayan said that this whole metropolitan idea is something for which I have to bear my part of responsibility, I find for the past several years, I've been going around the country and also sitting in the Center for Policy Research. And looking back on my 40 years experience, I find that from time to time, I allow myself to do some very, very rash things in the hope that that's what is needed. And then I spend a few years thereafter explaining why I did that. So, in a way, it's a question of continuous introspection. And you will have to bear with me when I go through this kind of a process each time when I meet a group, especially a distinguished scholarly academic group such as the one before me. So some of this may sound intensely personal and therefore not as objective as it should be. I realize also that the city region itself is a concept that is not very well established. In some of the other countries, they may have a slightly better record, but this is a topic which permits a great deal of ambivalence and also quite a bit of going back and forth on what are the issues and what should one do about them. The reason for this particular presentation is for the past year or so, we in the CPR have been engaged in a study of 5 city regions. That's Bombay and Hyderabad and Bangalore and Chennai and Calcutta. I'm deliberately using the old names and not Bengaluru and Mumbai because these are the cities by their names that I know them. And we have also been trying to take a look at our neighbors, whether it's Bangladesh or Pakistan, and what's been happening. These mega cities, you can take any definition you want. You can call them multi-municipal, you can call them city regions, you can call them 4 million plus 5 million plus going on to be 10 million, etc., etc. Whatever it is, they are mega. They are multiple jurisdictions, and there is no escape from that. These are the kind of beasts with whom we have not been terribly familiar. Certainly not, in the subcontinent. Much of this is recent, 30 years ago at the best, or 40 years. And we really do not know how to deal with it. The only construct with which we have been familiar is the municipal construct. And the municipal construct is largely of a British vintage, going back to 1920s and so on and so forth. So in a way, we are wrestling with a new set of problems, and we are not entirely sure what we have done in the recent past or what we are trying to do now are really appropriate. So in a way, I'm using these meetings as an opportunity to try and get some clarity, some counterpoints to what we are currently doing. One of the things which I'm sure people in Singapore will realize more easily than others is that urbanization is a South Asian reality. So you have broadly, the figures here, and the Indian census. By the way, the Indian census does not recognize the word mega. It does recognize the million plus city, and we have 53 of them, and Pakistan has 7, Bangladesh has 3, Nepal, depending on what definition you use, the whole valley of Kathmandu, and in that case you have 1. So that is, in the case of India, in 2001, we had 35 of these cities which are more than 1 million. In 2011, the number has gone up to 53, as you can see. And the total, out of these 53, in the past 10 years, these are some of the new cities that have been added to the list. And it may come as a bit of a news to you that this place, Malappuram in Kerala, its growth rate is 896%. This is mainly because of reclassification. The Indian census, which is a time-honored census for a long time, it's a 100% head count census. And no head count census in the world is accepted without questioning by statisticians and scholars. Every head count census is held guilty of either undercounting or overcounting. And so the Indian census is also not entirely free of criticism. But the Indian census uses a particular criteria for defining an urban place, that it has to be a settlement of about 5,000 people, the density should be 400 persons per square kilometer, and then 75% of the male working population should be engaged in non-agricultural pursuits. So if these criteria simultaneously are met, then the census says the place qualifies to be urban. So what really happens is, irrespective of the population of that settlement, it is the application of that criteria which makes places to be declared as census. And so in a place like Malappuram, you will find that there are a lot of settlements in the periphery or adjoining the core city within what is considered as an agglomeration, which becomes census, and therefore the growth rate shoots up. Now, we should also note that apart from these census towns, some towns are called towns by the government. It may be an industrial township, it may be a company township. Now, those towns may not meet the census criteria, but nevertheless, they have to be counted. So you have something called statutory towns, and you have something called census towns. So you do get a funny paradox here. All towns, and all these towns need not necessarily have municipalities. So you do have a situation where all urban areas need not be municipal, and all municipal areas need not be urban. Now, this itself is a fairly interesting point for statisticians and demographers to start arguing about. Taking these mega cities, these are the mega cities. I will not be saying much in the case of Delhi because it is pretty well known. Maybe it will come out in questions and answers. But these are broadly the cities which have some shared characteristics. If you take Bombay, you will find that there are 7 municipal corporations and 13 municipalities. And if you take the metropolitan region as a whole, you are talking about a 4,400 square kilometer area. The concept of Bombay as a metropolitan area is more or less understood by the people for the simple reason that right from British days you had those 2 long commuter lines, Central and Western Railway, and a whole generation or 2 or 3 generations of people are used to getting up very early in the morning and catching the suburban train and going into Bombay. So this is a metropolitan area. People generally know that. Now you'll find that in terms of 2001, 2011, the population, the overall population has really gone up, to about, the region as a whole is about 22 million. It's quite a sizable number. Oftentimes, people say the core city itself is losing population. This is not really true. You will find in the case of Calcutta the Calcutta core city, there is a slight decline in absolute numbers. But in the rest of the metropolitan area, growth is taking place, densification is also taking place. So what this really tells you is that if you take a view, a metropolitan view, you find that it is not a question of an urbanization slowing down. It is really a question of the agglomeration densifying itself in a broad sense and population increase taking place, in a broad sense. So each of these areas, are fairly sizable. So in the case of Bangalore, apart from the fact that the Bangalore Municipal Corporation itself, has had expanded limits, the metropolitan region is about 8,000 square kilometers. And in the case of Chennai, it is roughly about 1,200 square kilometers. In the case of Hyderabad, for instance, the municipal corporation itself is an area of about 800 is about square kilometers, 878, but the metropolitan region is about 7,000 square kilometers. So one of the things that is happening is, why are these metropolitan areas getting so big? What is there to show about them? Take, for example, the demographic primacy. The metropolitan region's population to the state's total population and the country's urban population is quite significant. And you'll find that in terms of absolute numbers and also as percentage, it is quite high. Therefore, there is a demographic primacy here. In the case of Delhi, if you take the national capital region, the national capital region is a 4-state region. You will find that it's a very, very large area, and you're talking about a 33,000 square kilometer area, and the population all around, has been increasing. I'll come back to this later on. One of the concepts was that by taking the national capital region, part of the problems of Delhi, can find a solution. But what's been happening is the population of Delhi, as also the other areas, have been growing up. If you take Dhaka, for example, you'll find that Dhaka has 14% of Bangladesh's total urban population, and you also find that the metropolitan area is close to about 1,600 square kilometers. This is true to some extent in the case of Karachi as well. And so there is a demographic primacy once again, in these two cases as well. The economic primacy is well understood in whichever way, you want to express that in terms of GDP or anything else that you want to use. They are significant economic engines. And of late you find that each of these metropolitan city regions are standing out for something that is quite prominent, as in the case of Bangalore for IT, Chennai in the case of automobiles, and Hyderabad also to some extent for IT and ITES. So the economic primacy is there. The demographic primacy, the economic primacy. And the global visibility, whether these cities are consciously trying to promote themselves or otherwise, they are being watched, they are being looked at for a whole variety of reasons, and there are scholars, who are looking at this all the time, whatever may be the criteria, of their analysis and comparisons. And you find that all these cities are featured in the Economist list of 120 odd cities. So whether we like it or not, this global attention is becoming an important aspect of the South Asian cities. Their scores may not be very high, but they do figure in the list. In other words, they are being watched at all the time, and insofar as there is a desire on the part of the business, on the part of the political people, on the part of the citizens themselves, that they do have to count in world ranking. These particular figures keep propping up, whatever the consequences. In each of these cities, you have multiple organizational arrangements. Particularly in regard to spatial planning, you find that there are multiple arrangements. Because there is a metropolitan authority, it does not mean that they are sovereign in that particular jurisdiction. So a variety of agencies exist. In many cases, the urban local bodies exercise some planning powers. In some cases, specific settlements, whether they are industrial settlements or new towns, they exercise. For example, Mumbai, which has a fairly reasonable structure for planning purposes, you have the Metropolitan Region Development Authority, but you also have the Bombay Municipal Corporation with its planning powers. For the new town of Navi Mumbai, you have a separate organization which has these planning powers. And in a way, this is the position with regard to Calcutta also. And in the case of Chennai, the Chennai Metropolitan Development Authority may be wielding more powers compared to others. In the case of Bangalore, it is quite a complicated situation because you have a BDA and a BMRDA, and there are also local planning areas and local planning authorities. In Hyderabad, there is this Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority, which is responsible, for overall planning. But over a period of past 6-7 years, somehow this planning jurisdiction appears to have been diluted quite a bit, and currently the Metropolitan Authority is focusing more on the new areas. You have multiple sector-specific institutions, and this is just a sample. I mean, it can be repeated for other functions as well. You have multiple laws, and at any given time, it does become a major exercise. Of course, every law, every new law has one particular clause which says, notwithstanding any other law for the time being, this law will provide. Now, when you write that kind of a provision in all laws, no laws really provide. And so what the lawyers would call as a non obstante clause, it really does not apply. So we do have some problems. The multiple jurisdictions, I already mentioned. You have municipal corporations, municipalities, town panchayats, census towns, villages. And there are multiple jurisdictions. Would life be simpler if there were lesser number of such municipal entities? One does not know. But the reality is that there are a number of such bodies. If you look at the governance situation again, take for example in the case of Delhi. Delhi is both a national territory, it's a capital territory presided over by the Lieutenant Governor as an appointee of the Government of India. You have a separate state, the state of Delhi with the Chief Minister. You have corporations. Until a few weeks ago, we had one corporation that became three, and you have three corporations, the New Delhi Municipal Committee plus a cantonment. You have these various states. In the case of Dhaka, the Dhaka City Corporation, again, until a couple of years ago was one. Recently it was split into two. You have other municipalities. In the case of Karachi, it's very interesting. There was a Karachi Metropolitan Corporation. During Parvez Musharraf's time, the National Reconstruction Bureau set up a very special arrangement making Karachi into a Karachi district administration, almost giving it a city-state kind of powers. And the mayor or the Nazim of the Karachi district government was to be elected by an electoral college consisting of a number of local bodies. That lasted for about 5 years. In 2010, that was taken out. The old Sindh Local Government Act was revived, and we are back to a metropolitan corporation. So there have been some halting steps to metropolitan governance. As I said, in the case of Dhaka, you have a capital development authority which is called Raju, which has been in existence since 1987. In the case of Karachi, you can say the Improvement Trust becomes a development authority, and the development authority gets merged into the Karachi Metropolitan Corporation, and then you have these various changes taking place. If some kind of a storyline can be drawn, not that I'm choosing Pakistan specially, but in the case of Pakistan, at least scholars have identified that the autonomy exercised by local governments is in some inverse ratio as far as the regime at the national level is concerned. Whenever there is an authoritarian regime, local government autonomy appears to do better. Whenever there is an elected government at the national level, the local government's autonomy appears to be diluted. So there are these halting steps that are being taken from time to time towards metropolitanization and taking a metropolitan view of decision making. In some cases, they try to expand the core city. Bangalore has been expanded, Chennai has been expanded, Hyderabad has been expanded, Kolkata marginally, but not in the case of Mumbai. In some cases, the metropolitan region itself is thought to be created. A very interesting question is, what is the rationale, what is the criteria for defining or changing the metropolitan delineation? Even in the case of Chennai, currently there is a debate going on as to whether the metropolitan area is 1,200 square kilometers as now, or should it be expanded to 8,000. There are various theories about this, various surmises, some of them quite plausible, as to why these metropolitan areas are sought to be enlarged. The Delhi National Capital Region Board is a rather innovative kind of an experiment which was talked about in the late 1950s because it was felt that Delhi's problems will have to be solved within the region. And so, a special act of the Parliament, which was after obtaining the consent of the participating states, was enacted, and therefore you have a National Capital Region Planning Board with the Union Minister and the Chief Ministers and various other nominees. This particular example of a multi-state, multi-territorial kind of a board has not been repeated elsewhere. In some respects, the Region Planning Board has been successful. In many respects, it has not been successful. You do have a possible list of functions of this NCR Planning Board, and this is, fortunately, the judiciary has also held that as far as conflicts of jurisdiction are concerned, in matters of planning, the Planning Board NCR provides. This is an extremely important change that has come about in recent years. Some of you may or may not be aware that in India, the Constitution did specify that every 10 years, electoral constituencies should be adjusted in keeping with population changes. And as a result of that, in 1951, 1961, 1971, we did delimitation. But thereafter, the southern states of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra, and Kerala said, we are doing a reasonably good job in population planning, and so if this formula is applied, we will lose our population in comparison and therefore lose our seats in the parliament, and this is no way to treat us. And so Mrs. Indira Gandhi said, all right, fear not, we will freeze delimitation. And delimitation was frozen till 2001. As a result of that, from 1971 till 2001, the constituencies remained frozen. Parliamentary constituencies as well as assembly constituencies. The government also went to the extent of saying that this is an inducement for population planning. Though some of us argued that the people of India do not follow reproduction procedures depending on election arrangements. Notwithstanding that, the freeze went on till 2001, and later on a delimitation commission came into existence a few years ago, and today you find that urban constituencies are regaining some of their representation. So as a result of that, if you look at this, the Mumbai metropolitan region has as many as 10 out of 48 MPs in Maharashtra and 60 out of 288 MLAs. 23% of Maharashtra's electorate is in the Mumbai region. So it is in Kolkata, 17% in Chennai, 18% in Bangalore, and 12%, which means that these metropolitan regions are a political reality with such a big share of your electorate and with so many members of parliament and so many MLAs, and I'm not giving you the count of the municipal corporators, there are a large number of elected representatives, and they are all operating in the same territorial space without any clear demarcation of what their responsibilities are. This therefore becomes an extremely important factor. And the same thing is true in regard to the Delhi, Dhaka and Karachi as well. The political prominence, whether you like it or not. So the question is, there is always this particular adjustment to what extent national political leadership can come to terms with the local political leadership in whichever way you look at it. So very quickly, all decisions come to that. Now, Dr. Narayan referred to this constitutional amendment. The amended constitution provides for something called a Metropolitan Planning Committee for all cities which have more than 1 million people. It is left to the state government to decide on the composition, though broad principles are given here. The Constitution itself provides some interesting terms of reference. And this is the only provision in the Constitution which recognizes a metropolitan region, which recognizes its multi-jurisdictional character, which recognizes planning and coordination as an important metropolitan task, and it therefore lists down these important requirements. But notwithstanding this, there are no takers. So in the case of Kolkata, a Metropolitan Planning Committee came into existence 5 years after the amendment was brought in. And now, after the most recent changes that have taken place in the state of West Bengal, it has not been reconstituted. In Mumbai, it has been brought into existence very recently. It is not functioning. Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, this constitutional provision has not been implemented at all. The question is, why is this so? Some possible problems are, it could well be that this Metropolitan Planning Committee stipulates that 2/3 of the members of the Metropolitan Committee should be drawn from local level councillors. The role of the core city mayor is not very clear. There is a limited perception of metropolitan level problems by local body members. And the parastatals of the state appear to be somewhat outside. And there is a continued reluctance and resistance from the existing parastatal organizations. So, one of the important issues here is that in spite of the demographic primacy, economic primacy, political primacy, and the serious institutional problems faced by these metropolitan areas, why is it that what has been suggested has no takers? Broadly speaking, this is a problem which some other countries have tried to deal with, in their own way. You have your city government, city-state governments in China. You have an elected two-tier government as in London or Tokyo. And you have a territorial polycentrism as in North America or South America. And you also have interlocal cooperation arrangements as in New York or Mexico. Now, somehow, in India and in the South Asian situation, the arrangements that are in possession or that are sought to be created or argued about, they appear to defy any typology. Some common problems seem to be that there is a very strong state dominance. The provincial governments or the state governments somehow seem to feel that it is their voice that should prevail. There is an overriding state political agenda. There is a fear of elected mayors. There is certainly a very large number of elected representatives, but they do not necessarily have a metropolitan focus. So the question arises whether city regions should be political entities at all. Are there alternatives and models to look for? Is there an interest in these issues? Is there an audience? I do want to add one particular point when I talk about strong state dominance. We have been looking at the results of provincial elections, state assembly elections, and also the results of the elections in the respective main cities. We find, let us take one example in the case of Tamil Nadu. In the previous assembly, the DMK took the majority of seats and ADMK was down below. In the most recent elections, the ADMK more or less substituted DMK and DMK has gone down. The same results are repeated in the case of Chennai Corporation. The same is the situation with regard to Kolkata. In other words, whatever is a political agenda of the state appears to prevail over the local authority as well. Does it mean that the local authority as such does not have an opportunity to shape an agenda of its own? Will there continue to be dependencies of the higher level of government? And if that is the position, how do we deal with the new challenges? I'm not getting into that because some of that is very familiar to all of you, and I'm sure you will have a number of queries about that. Considering the problems of the need to keep these economic engines going, for which a whole variety of activities, a whole variety of interventions are needed, whose should this responsibility be in very large countries like India? Should the national government be expected to orchestrate the whole thing? Should the state governments take it as a responsibility? Is there any political, economic and civic space available for these metropolitan cities and the various constituent municipalities which comprise them? And is there an audience at all for talking about these issues and for raising a certain level of awareness? Because right now, the position appears to be that the demand side does not seem to be very manifest. And such responses as have been provided so far appear to be more a supply side response. Insofar as I personally had a hand in the supply side response, I do consider perhaps some of my colleagues and myself, what we did in the best of intentions was not appropriate. That could well be the reason. But nevertheless, I feel that these are important questions about which we need to think about, talk about, argue about, and see what lies ahead. Thank you.
Requirements in urban management. Is it possible to think that the very fact that post the recent elections, the local bodies have elected the same political parties that have been elected to state legislatures is itself a manifestation of a supply-side demand where the public are actually expecting some kind of responses which have been different from the earlier 5 years? And that this entire architecture that the Government of India and all of us have been creating for the last 30, 40 years have totally ignored this. And perhaps therefore it's a time to look at the city institutions and governance institutions not from the point of view of institutions to govern, but institutions more to respond to public aspirations, which are very different now than they were about 20, 30 years ago. I'd just like to post that as a question, but then perhaps you could take a few more questions.
Yeah, sure.
So, just one very interesting aspect which I thought was missing, and I'm sure you can add to it. Where do what is the revenue base of urban areas in India? In this case of India, and where do the budgets come from? Are they local taxation pays, which are entirely in the jurisdiction of the local bodies, or do they actually drive the revenues from the state and federal government?
Could the recent feature on India in The Economist highlighted Surat as an example of progressive development of an urban space? Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Does Surat provide a model for people-driven local government of the kind you were alluding to? Because it does strike me that in Europe, particularly in Britain in the 19th century, politicians built national careers on the strength of having been very good local government managers. I'm thinking particularly of Joseph Chamberlain beginning to supply the city of Birmingham with gas in the 1860s and going on to become a national figure. I don't think we've seen anything like that, but perhaps Surat provides some models where local politicians may rise on the strength of their performance locally.
Okay.
Can we take these three?
Yeah, sure. I think this last question, the first question, are somewhat interconnected. In the case of India also, the people who came into national leadership came up on the local government ladder. Jawaharlal Nehru was chairman of the Allahabad Municipal Corporation. Vallabhbhai Patel was chairing Ahmedabad. Many of our national leaders came through the municipal ladder. But for some reason, once they went up, they did not seem to feel that local government needed some attention. They almost discarded the ladder by which they climbed. So much so, the Calcutta Corporation, which was in the vanguard of India's freedom movement, was the first corporation to be thrown out of office. It was superseded in a Cromwellian fashion in 1948 itself. The Madras Corporation was superseded, and for 24 years it remained under supersession. So this was part of the problem, whittling down the municipal domain and taking their powers over and putting them in state-created parastatals. Now, so to that extent, where should really demands be addressed, became somewhat diffused. Now, when you talk about Surat, it's not that Surat created, the Surat model of municipal government, its municipal structure has been very much the same, for all these years. But what happened in that area is that, and this is true of all of Gujarat, where the municipal domain has slowly come back to them. some of the functions which were previously performed by parastatal organizations have gone back to the municipality. And I think in the case of Surat, the plague epidemic gave a great opportunity for them to rearrange the configuration of municipal and parastatal responsibility. So Surat is a city where the city corporation counts. In many other cities, not in Gujarat, elsewhere, in many other cities, the city government does not count. Surat, in spite of the fact that it is not a very attractive city, I mean, there is not one single building in Surat which you can call sufficiently attractive to be photographed in front. Not one single building, but the place is scrupulously clean. The tax collection rate is very high. It's not that people are coming out in the streets demanding this or that, but their performance is, in their action. Tax compliance is very high. The processes of municipal regulation and approval is very high, which also answers partly your question, sir. The only revenue base of Indian cities are property taxes. Property taxes and some user fees to a limited extent. Some of the more buoyant sources of revenue arising from land development and new areas and so on and so forth are in the hands of non-municipal bodies. Every state has a state finance commission which makes an allocation of revenue sharing formula. But because the state governments themselves complain of lack of resources, during the past 10 years, the Government of India's Finance Commission has been asked to look into the needs of the local bodies and see to what extent the state government revenues require augmentation so that they can help them. Some modest improvements are being suggested. Otherwise, the total expenditure of local bodies in India is less than 5%, of the total exchequer. So financially, they are almost bankrupt. And much of the money is utilized only in revenue and staff expenditure, so they do not have a revenue base at all. I should also mention in this that the constitutional amendment provides a whole list of functions which should be discharged by the municipalities. But it is up to the state government to decide and pass a law whether those functions should really be devolved or not. Here again you find the position varying from state to state. Gujarat is one of the few states where the functional domain has been entrusted. In many states, the functional domain is not entrusted to local bodies. The variation is fairly high. So, is Surat the model? I would say properly, local bodies with a functional mandate is the answer. We did have that functional mandate before. We missed out on that. We took it out. We diluted it. We have to go back to that. So to that extent, and that is the faith on which this entire constitutional amendment is based. As far as the chairman's question is concerned, I do feel that demand from citizens is extremely important. But when you take a contemporary city, most of the citizens, their basic interest is to earn a living, to carry on with their daily business. They cannot afford to spend their time supplicating, petitioning, joining in processions and writing, protests all the time. So instead of waiting for the citizens to express their demand, I think it is important that Indians and South Asians understand that there was a time when we did a better job. Why do we have this terrible loss of memory. Why can't we go back to the domain which we understood well before, and why can't we restitute the domain?
Okay, I'm a Singaporean, so Singaporean Chinese, so this will be an unusual question for me to ask, but do you see a situation where, because from what your description, the governance of cities is what you'd politely call quite messy, where the private sector and the people sector will take over running many of the functions. And I give you the example of the Dharaveen slum in Mumbai, which has been proven to be exceedingly efficient, and people have built a community there. Do you see more people-led grassroots solutions to problems?
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, you talked of the bifurcation of the Dhaka Corporation, for instance, and you said that in Delhi, for instance, there are 3 corporations. As you know, that there is also a huge problem with regard to the politics of the bifurcation of the Dhaka Corporation, and we are getting some kind of a sense that there is a growing movement like the division of Bengal. I mean, it's like halving Bengal in 2. Is an answer having then a central city, a small city, much in the fashion of the city of London, and boroughs, as in New York, absolutely independent and autonomous with its own chair, etc., running the local governance. One little point about what you said about the state government superseding or rather prevailing over city. Now, each of the South Asian cities have their own sort of evolution. Karachi, for instance, has a population which is ethnically very different from the states surrounding it. Sindh, it's a Urdu-speaking MQM population. Their leadership have very little intention, wish to go further up the ladder into national politics. Controlling Karachi is good enough for the MQM. So there, the point is, it's an isolated problem in Karachi, and it's unique. And in many ways, all the South Asian cities perhaps have unique features. They have to be addressed uniquely rather than generalize about them. That's a very broad point, but the first is more difficult.
Okay, let me, in essence, we are saying that whether it's a metropolitan situation or whether it is a smaller city, there is a good deal of diversity. And how do we really accommodate the diversity? One way is that there are situations where the city government as such is not able to perform or is not able to reach or finds itself excluded. And Dharavi is an example of that, where somehow a community prompted by compulsions of daily existence brings about a certain synergy within itself, a certain collaboration, among the people living in Dharavi, and therefore is able to carry on. I think that has been the character of many cities in the course of history. And I feel that that will continue to be the case, even if it is not a slum. In these very big cities, it's quite possible that there will be many parts where the city government or the provincial government will not be able to respond to the needs. And therefore, one has to try and see how those community needs or those needs at the community level can be met. Apart from Dharavi, Bombay has had a very long history of something called advanced locality management, whereby different municipal wards, the residents and so on, they used to come together and said, all right, these are the things which we will do. And in many cities, you do have those kinds of examples. I'm not regarding them as part of a urban management design. They reflect the diversity, they reflect, the different ways by which communities evolve and communities find some kind of an identity by themselves. So I do not, I look upon that as a part of a city phenomenon. But I don't think conscious efforts need to be made to formalize them. Because if you try to say other slums should also be like Dharavi, it may not work. In the case of Dharavi, it has worked. One of the ways it has worked is that there have been at least some 20-25 different plans for getting rid of Dharavi and sort of building something in it. The strength of the community lies in the fact they have been able to successfully resist all these grand plans. The other side, the uniqueness, which you say that as far as the leadership is concerned, you know, the small municipality and so on. If you take the Greater London example, after a good deal of debate, when that Greater London Council was formed, and then Margaret Thatcher said, this is big government, and I don't want it, and I want it abolished. And then she had a minister for London, and the national government took on the responsibility for administering London. That did not help. And then, you know, after a gap of about some 7-8 years, the Greater London Authority was reintroduced. But there was a fairly extensive exercise on what should be the responsibilities of the boroughs and what should be the responsibilities of the Greater London Authority, and how the Greater London Authority will have an assembly of its own, and how the Greater London Authority will have a directly elected mayor, and how this 35 boroughs, if I remember, will have, you know, their own setup. It was a fairly time-consuming political exercise to decide on what are metropolitan level functions and what are local level functions, and what should be the functional domain of the directly elected mayor of GLC. Now, he's supposed to be responsible for strategic planning of all of Greater London. He's responsible for transport. He's responsible for a few other, you know, functions as well. And how are conflicts between boroughs and the Greater London Authority to be reconciled? Incidentally, the Greater London Assembly constituencies are different from the borough constituencies. It's not like our Indian Constitution provision, where a local level councillor is metamorphosed as a metropolitan councillor. There are two different electoral arrangements. And in the most recent elections which took place a few months ago between Boris Johnson and Ken Livingstone, it was a closely contested election. It was rather interesting that though Boris Johnson was supposed to belong to the same party as David Cameron, in his acceptance speech he said, we survived the rains, we survived the BBC, and we also survived the endorsement by David Cameron. That was the kind of distance that the directly elected mayor of London wanted to place. The people of London recognize the directly elected mayor Livingstone. They feel that he is an accountable person. I want to draw another example. One of the reasons why Delhi is comparatively doing a better job is it is a de facto city-state, a de facto city-state. Sheila Dixit likes to call herself the Chief Minister of Delhi. In effect, she is the mayor. She would not like to be called that. But she knows that in the event of trouble, politically, hers will be one of the heads to roll. And I feel there is an answer here. In many South Asian cities, the point of political accountability is absent. And as a result, in the diffused atmosphere, you do not know who is responsible for what.
Who does the Delhi police answer?
The Delhi police answers to the national government.
Home Ministry.
Singaporean, but I'm half an Indian, I always say. I spent several years of my life there. So I speak with some level of candid here. I hope you don't mind. Sir, I see that, I think your position on greater metropolitan control is great. It might be a solution. But could there be an adverse effect? In a sense that, as you know, many situations when there's increased amount of parties involved, things fail. From the Gurgaon city, where there were less government intervention to the state where it is now, to several instances like even Gandhinagar and so on and so forth. There are too many people involved, and therefore the corruptions will set in, the dysfunctionality will set in as well. So could there be a short-term worse scenario if more metropolitan power is given to a local authorities?
So many Indian megacities have the stigma of slums. And many years ago in Chennai, there was that effort by the DMK administration of that period, what was known as the slum clearance effort, which didn't seem to have had much effect. What is the extent of success in these megacities addressing the stigma of slums?
Yeah, just in response to the earlier questions, you were mentioning about the role of the mayor and how often in a lot of Indian cities, the figure of the mayor has almost become like a figurehead. So in terms of the sort of tiers of political representation, where you have the councillors, the MLAs, and then the MPs, is there any solution as to how to sort of increase the visibility of the Indian mayors of Indian cities vis-a-vis, you were mentioning the London example, or are we sort of condemned to a situation where those sort of figures really can't do much?
I think the questions regarding the powers to local councils and mayors, to some extent they are related, but let me deal with the question of slums. I would not regard the slums as a stigma of a society. I mean, they have been it's a question of what you regard as a slum. In the case of Bombay, 60% of the people in Bombay Corporation, Greater Bombay Corporation area are living in slums. But they are not settlements of the poor. It's because of the unavailability of service land, and a very large percentage of the people are priced out, of the housing market, affordable housing market, that they are, taking that kind of a shelter. So in a way, there is a certain dynamics here. And from time to time, various things, have been tried out. In the case of Calcutta, for instance, the slums came in mainly because when Calcutta became an industrial city, it coincided with a certain distress-induced migration from some of the other states. Without that supply of labor, Calcutta as a colonial city could not have reached its industrial prominence. Only yesterday, I read in the Singapore Straits paper that there is a shortage of labor for the small and medium enterprises, and restrictions on migrant labor will eventually hurt SMEs. So in a way, you find in the course of history of cities across the world, people have moved and they perform an important economic function. And as long as they are prepared to accept distinctly lower levels of services because of their personal, enhancement of income, they are performing a useful economic function. And these definitions of slums, what is a slum, where should they exist, and so on and so forth, there have been cases like that. So in 1970s, when we had this big exercise, late 1960s, as far as the Calcutta slum areas were concerned, it was suggested that let us treat the slums as part of the existing housing stock. And what they needed was the improvement of services. So let us provide those services. We went up with that program to the government of India. Jawaharlal Nehru himself was emotionally very much upset about slums. And he often said, it's a shame on the national conscience that we have slums and we should get rid of them. Get rid of them and do what? Where do they go? All right. Then we went into slum upgradation. We did not do this alone. They were doing it in the kampungs of Indonesia. They were doing it in the Tondo foreshore of Manila. Lachlan Curry in South America was arguing in its favor. Internationally, people were recognizing that so long as this economic process works, you will find this supply of labor in search of employment. And so long as employment is found, that migration will take place. They may be communities of migrants, they may be communities of others. And therefore we started incorporating. Now once again you find that, as our friend said, once again you find you are now looking at slums, not as settlements of productive people. You are looking at slums as people occupying prime land. And the motivation is, how do we capture that land? And in order to capture that land and accumulate further capital, how do we get rid of it? So it's a sort of a political equation that is taking place. So when you invent a principle called monetization of urban land, in some circumstances it can be a benign principle, but quite often it can be a very devious, ruthless, discriminatory principle. And that is where the state comes in. Where do you hold the balance of public interest vis-a-vis private rationality? So it's a very tough question. And you're not going to be able to solve it by looking upon slums as a stigma. Okay. As far as powers to the local councillors are concerned, I would like to believe that corruption is not the exclusive domain of local politicians. The propensity to be corrupt is widely distributed across the political spectrum. The municipal councillor genetically is not more corrupt than a member of parliament. So if that be the truth, then and similarly, mind you, vesting of powers, the same argument can be used by saying, why vest powers of a minister? Because the minister may become corrupt. So if you say, don't vest powers on a councillor because he will become more corrupt, I don't think that is a fair argument. The answer lies in dealing, with other things. Now, the question with regard to the mayors is very, very important. And that is where perhaps, certainly in the case of South Asia, because we are very large, populous countries, as a result of this constitutional amendment, today we have 3 million elected representatives in India. 3 million from rural and urban local bodies. 1/3 of them have to be women. Now, we have about 6,000, which is the sum total of all the members of the provincial assemblies and all the members of the 2 houses of parliament. So the 6,000 people have been in power for quite long. And now they have to share power with 3 million elected representatives. Now, this is not going to be an easy arrangement at all, because the arithmetics of representation has changed. But the chemistry of representation has to be worked out very, very carefully. That is part of the problem. What is the domain of the local people and what's the domain of the other levels of people? From that point of view, why should we not have, whether it is an elected or whether he is an appointed head of a city, it does not matter whether he is a mayor or whether he is an appointed commissioner, but give him clear set of responsibilities and hold him accountable. Unfortunately, the term of office of a mayor in India varies from 1 year to 5 years. Now, a 1-year mayor is an absurdity. I mean, Delhi's mayor is a 1-year wonder. And even though you have now created 3 mayors instead of 1, by the time they find out where their city boundary is, it is time for them to go. It's an absurd situation. And there's no point in having those kind of ceremonial mayors. I mean, if you were to ask me, I've been living in Delhi, who is the mayor of, I don't know. You ask anybody in Bombay, who is the mayor? They would not know. So I don't think we can afford to have these kind of ceremonial entities. And from that point of view, there is definitely a case for revisiting some of that. I think in essence it is a question once again of whether you are prepared to, if you accept the democratic principles of organization, whether you are prepared to vest people with authority. Because I do believe if you don't give a person authority, you have no right to demand accountability.
Thank you. We'll take that as absolutely the last question, yeah? Because we are running out of time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Your command of the details of these different metropolitan areas is incredible. I obviously can't ask you any question that's specific to the Indian context, which is going to be at the kind of level that you've already been speaking at. But I'd just like to revisit one of the final issues that you left us with, and that's that disconnect between the conditions of possibility on the supply side for metropolitanization and the seeming absence of the demand floor to meet that. And my question has to do with what the motivation for the supply side, in your case, going back to the personal dimension of this, is in the first place, and in particular perhaps rumination on where that motivation comes from. And I'm wondering does it have to do with there being at the supranational level certain discourses through the World Bank, for example, about appropriate scales of governance? Does it come from recognition of there being models or cases out there in the world that might be or might not be suitable for the Indian context? Or is it precisely because of recognition of this historical antecedent whereby there was a time when things were done better and the possibility of rekindling that? But perhaps just as an addendum to that final point, is it also possible that looking back at that earlier period as a resource for doing things better, we wouldn't be using terms like the city as an engine of growth? So that in itself is something which seems to be post-1991, a way in which we understand the function of urban regions.
So that's it.
No, I think those are very, very important questions. As far as the demand side is concerned, as the supply side, one can argue. I mean, these issues. Some of my colleagues and myself are possessed with this mad idea, and let us say that the supply side is on account of our personal madness. But leaving that aside, on the demand side, I feel it's very much a case of metropolitan survival. Take, for example, water. In the case of Bangalore, today water for Bangalore has to come from Kaveri, taken from a long distance and pumped for nearly, over 1,000 meter, elevation. Hyderabad says we can't draw water only from Krishna, we have to go to Godavari now to draw water. Even in a place like Calcutta, where the river Hooghly, the salinity levels have distinctly dropped, but nevertheless, the individual municipalities are trying to suck water below their feet by deep tube wells and only taking more and more arsenic. Okay, if you take, for example, a case like, even drainage, it is now clearly demonstrated that Bombay is seriously subject to flooding and vulnerability unless the common water courses are taken care of. Now, these are metropolitan level issues. They cannot be sorted out at the individual constituent level. We were pleasantly surprised to find that there were at least 1,000 water bodies in the so-called 7,000 square kilometer area of Hyderabad. Mindlessly, road projects are undertaken, new area development is undertaken, which is plugging these water bodies. Ecology, I think, is going to be a very major issue which has to be dealt with at the metropolitan level. Same thing is true with regard to transport connectivity. So, your basic need of water, your basic need of drainage, your basic need of transport, and importantly, your basic need of solid and liquid waste removal. When all these entities come together in one particular geographical space, you need a metropolitan view of things. Planning is equally important. How much land do you need? Do you need to expand metropolitan areas so that additional lands can be captured for possible market development, possible real estate development? Why do you need this? What kind of a process do you have to go through in order to establish, your jurisdiction? My feeling is that these questions, as investment increases, as employment increases, as the demand for space increases, these questions of contestation will become very much more severe. And they have to be dealt with, World Bank or no World Bank. They have to be dealt with because these are problems which are created as, problems of growth, not problems of stagnation. And we have to address them. And they have to be addressed both at the sub-metropolitan and metropolitan level.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, perhaps go on, but fortunately we are running out of time. So I don't think this is a kind of a discussion that I can sum up it in any particular way, except to say that we have so much of experience from listening here in Sonam Krishnan that actually, if you look at South Asian city problems from sitting in Singapore, it does sometimes appear as though always a question arises. Look at a managed city like Singapore, why can it not be managed in a similar way in South Asia? And I think what Professor Ramakrishnan has been able to do here is to point out the kind of diversity of interests of institutions, of political aspirations, expectations, and some kind of economic pressures that are happening in South Asia. We're thankful to him, grateful to him for sparing us this time.